Hi, my name is French, and today I'm going to be teaching you how to mordant and scour protein-based fibers. And so what that means is that we're going to be preparing natural fibers that are protein, so they came from animals, and we're going to be preparing them to be able to dye naturally. So the first thing that we're going to be doing is scouring. And scouring means to wash your fibers. And then we're going to be mordanting, and mordanting is a way of getting your natural dye to bite or to adhere to your fibers and to be able to stay there, hopefully forever. So today's fibers that we're going to be working with are a hand knit toque. This is just hand knit with raw wool. It's 100% wool, and it's just the natural cream color. We're also going to be working with a silk scarf. But you can do this with any sort of protein fibers, so whether it's silk or wool or alpaca or llama, you can use that for all of these. This is not the same instructions that you'd be using for plant-based fibers or cellulose fibers. So not for cottons and not for linens and that sort. Okay, so what you're going to need are dye pots. Dye pots are just stainless steel pots with lids that are no longer food safe. So everything that we're using here, you're not going to be using for food afterwards, but we have our dye pots, we have our heat source, there's water in the dye pots, we have a digital kitchen scale. I like to keep a couple of metal bowls around just for transferring objects and whatnot. We're going to need a pen, a couple of spoons, a thermometer because we need to know how hot things are getting. We're going to be using Orvus Paste, and this is going to be our scouring agent. And we're going to be using alum. Proper name is potassium aluminum sulfate. You're also going to need to use a mask. This one is an N95 and it's got the out valve, so this is good to keep our lungs nice and healthy. And then we've got our kitchen gloves, or just like gloves, so that anytime that we're working with our hands in any of the solutions, we're not going to be using bare hands, and we're going to be wearing a mask whenever we're working with any of the powders. So first things first is we're going to take out our silk. So I got this silk from Mewa. It's just a silk scarf, and nothing has been done to it yet. And then this hat is just a hand knit hat, and nothing has been done to it yet. The first step that you're going to do with your dry dyeables is you're going to weigh them with your digital kitchen scale. So we're going to turn on our digital kitchen scale and then put it in there into the bowl, and that's just to hold it, and it's 83 grams. So I'm going to write that on my arm with a permanent marker so that future me remembers, because if past me doesn't leave these notes for future me isn't going to remember anything, and future me needs to know the number 83 grams. What's interesting for that 83 grams for me is that I know that these silk scarves from Mewa, the 29 inch by 29 inch, these have always been 20 grams each. So it means that this hat is 63 grams. Fantastic. Okay, next step is we are going to put on our gloves, and we are going to open up the lid of the pot. And it's a little bit hot right now. I've started to raise the heat on it. I'm going to turn it up a little bit. Our temperature that we're going to try to get to is 180 degrees Fahrenheit. But first step is scouring. So I'm going to take the Orvus Paste and a spoon. And you use about a teaspoon of this per kilogram of fiber. And since we're using 83 grams, we're using a very, very small amount of the Orvus Paste. So tiny amount. into the pot. Put your lids back on things because, you know, if you have a tendency to drop things, which I do, you don't want it to be dropped. So we're going to take the spoon. We're going to slosh around the soap into that water. And then we're going to put our dyeables into the water. Now, this will work for any sort of protein fabric yardage. You know, like if you have a silk shirt, you can just do like a ready-made garment, like this hat. You can do skeins of wool. Get that in there. Making sure to get these all the way soaked. But yeah, any sort of protein fibers. The example on the wall behind me, this is done with wool melting cloth, and these are all naturally dyed squares. And they are 80% wool and 20% nylon. But you can see even with the 20% nylon, there's enough wool there to scour and to mordant and then to naturally dye. Okay, so now we're going to check the temperature of the water with our thermometer. Great. So it's slowly climbing. And right now it's at 120 degrees Fahrenheit. And since this is like a cooking show, we're not just going to stand here and wait for this to slowly get warmer, but I'm going to agitate a little. There we are. Now you're going to bring this up to temperature. So again, bringing this up to 180 degrees Fahrenheit. Being very careful not to go over 180 degrees Fahrenheit because you don't want to have your fibers get shocked. And also if you're working with like the wool hat, or if you're working with skeins of wool, you wouldn't want it to felt, especially since there's soap and you're going to be agitating it just a little bit to slosh around the soap in there. So once it is up to 180 degrees Fahrenheit, you want to sustain that temperature for about an hour and just let that cook. Then you're going to remove your pot from your heat source, and then you're going to bring it to a cleared out sink or washing tub, and you're going to remove the lid, being careful that hot things are hot, and if your pot, the inside temperature is 180 degrees Fahrenheit, your outside temperature is probably going to be close. So you're going to remove the lid, you're going to pour out your water and dyeables, your fiber, into the bottom of the pot. Let it cool until it's just able to touch with your gloves, and then you're going to rinse it out with very, very warm water, hot water really, from the tap, and then slowly letting the water cool just a little bit so you're not shocking the fibers from being very hot to very cold. And you're going to rinse out all of the soap, all of that Orvus paste. And then you're going to set your dyeable fibers aside, and then we're going to fill your dye pot back up with hot water, about 2/3 of the way full for this guy. Yeah. And then we're going to get mordanting. So I'm going to set this guy aside because just like a cooking show, I have some pre-scoured dyeables. So those are here. And this guy's going to move to the side. Okay, so it is the exact same hat, which is the exact same amount of fiber as that hat, and a silk scarf. So these are both also 83 grams. I'd weighed them previously. And another dye pot full of just water. And so please note that these are pretty small dye pots. These are more of my travel dye pots, or when I'm doing small amounts of fibers. If you're going to be doing, you know, a meter of fabric, you would not be able to put it into a dye pot this big because it would get really jammed in there. You need to have enough water and enough room in your dye pot for your fibers to be able to flow in there fairly easily. Okay, so these guys are already wet. They're just got rinsed from being scoured. And now I'm going to have to weigh out my alum. So anytime that you're going to be working with any sort of powdered materials, you're going to put on your mask. So I'm going to speak as loudly as I can, but making sure that it has a really good fit around your face is fantastic. Here we are. And then you're going to need to know how much alum to use. I use 15% the weight of my fiber of alum. So I'm going to need that 83 grams, and I'm going to times that by 0.15, and then that's going to be 15% of the weight of my fiber. How am I going to know what that is? I'm going to take out my phone, and I'm going to type in 83, and I'm going to times it by 0.15, which is 12.45. So I'm going to need roughly 12.5 grams of alum to be able to mordant my fibers. So I'm going to turn this scale back on. I'm going to put my gloves on. I'm going to open up my alum. And this is a lot of alum in this jar. You can get very small amounts of it from Mawa. And so I'm going to be very careful not to just dump the alum into the vessel, because it would hit the bottom and then it would kind of fluff up and it would become airborne. And you don't want that to happen because, again, you don't want to be inhaling this. So being very careful to put it into the bottom of your bowl here. Cool. 12.5 grams. All right, and again, putting the lid back on the powder so that you don't accidentally dump it over. Then I'm going to take my 12.5 grams of my alum, remove the lid from my pot, and I'm going to be putting it into the water. Cool. So, just going to put the lid back on the pot for a second there. And I'm going to remove my mask because now there's no powdered substances that I'm working with. The powder is now in the dye pot. So alum is water soluble, and we're going to wait for that to dissolve in the water. It is slowly getting hotter, and we are going to eventually bring this up to 180 degrees Fahrenheit. But a note on putting your materials into your alum. The reason that we want to have these scoured materials wet is that we want to add them into our pot wet. The reason is that we want all of this dissolved alum to evenly strike the fibers. I think the best analogy for that I've heard was taking a class with Michel Garcia. He is a natural dyer and chemist from France. He said, picture outside you have 20 dogs, and inside you have 20 bowls of food. And if you open up the door just a little bit, the first dog is going to get in there and it's just going to eat as much food as it can, and the 20th dog is going to have just a very little bit of food because it's not going to get there at the same time as the first. So you want to open the doors very wide, and all 20 dogs will come in and all will eat at the same time, and it will be very even. And so that analogy is essentially saying that we want these fibers to be wet so that the alum will all strike the fibers evenly, and you'll have a really nice even mordanting, which then will lead to even dyeing, which is awesome. Okay, so now we're going to double check and see if all of the alum has dissolved into the water. And it has. So we're going to give it one last stir. Just make sure it's really dissolved. I'm going to set the lid aside, and now I'm going to take my 2 pre-wetted, pre-scoured pieces of fabric, and then as quickly as I can get them in there and really allow them to get fully submerged and allow for the mordanting. So now that they're in there, We are going to want to go in there and stir it and agitate. I usually do it every 10 minutes for the entire hour, and I just set my phone with an alarm so that I know every 10 minutes to go and stir it. But before you can do that, you want the water to be up to 180 degrees Fahrenheit, but no hotter. And you want to sustain that for 1 hour. So we're at 120 right now. And so what you're going to do is you're going to put the lid on and turn the heat up just a little. And we're going to allow the pot to get all the way up to 180. So again, once it gets up to 180, you're going to sustain it and just giving it a little stir, not agitating it too greatly, every 10 minutes for an hour. And then after the hour, you're going to turn your heat source off. You're going to remove your pot with the lid off of your heat source, and you're going to set it aside. And I usually set mine aside just underneath the table in my studio, and I put a little note on it that just says mordanting alum, 15% the weight of fiber, and then I put the date on it. And then I know that the next day I'm going to come in and I'm going to take that out. I'm going to hang it up, remove it from the pot, pour out the alum water, which again doesn't have that much alum in it now, and I'm going to hang up my mordanted fibers to dry. And I usually let them sit and hang for, I don't know, a few days at least. And then once they're dried, I'll take them and I'll either dye with them, or I'm going to put them each into their own Ziploc bags, and I'm going to label them with the silks. I would say 29-inch by 29-inch Mayowa silk scarf, scoured and mordanted with alum at 15% the weight of fiber. And then with the hat, I would say, knit wool hat, give the wool information, and then I would say scoured and mordanted at 15% the weight of fiber. And the reason that I do that is that I really need to have those notes for future me, because you don't want to mordant any of your fibers at more than 15% the weight of fiber. So if I didn't leave myself that note and then I found the scarf or the hat, 6 months down the line, I might think, oh, these aren't scoured or they're not mordanted, I need to do that again. And you don't want to over mordant with alum, because if you use too much alum, your fibers will become almost sticky feeling, and you can never rinse that out. And on that note, you want to use 15% the weight of fiber, because that's enough that your fibers are mordanted properly. Because if you use too little, the dyes won't adhere and hold onto your fibers for forever. But then if you use too much, it'll become sticky. So some dyers say to use as little as 8% the weight of fiber, and some say to use as much as 20% the weight of fiber. I think that that's too little and too much. So the way that I figured out 15% is that I took out all of my natural dye books and I wrote them down on my whiteboard, and I wrote down kind of in order to like who I trusted the most to who maybe I didn't trust as much in the books, because some of the books that I have are written by dye masters and some of them are just zines from the 1970s. So I'm not sure where folks were getting their knowledge from. So I wrote them down, and I wrote down how much each person said to mordant with alum. So some say like 9% the weight of fiber and some say 18. And I took those numbers and I did kind of weight the system a little bit, because I do trust Christine Behar from A Verb for Keeping Warm much more than I would trust a zine written in the 1970s by somebody I've never met. So with Christine's book, The Modern Natural Dyer, I put her in as kind of higher, the top standing on this list. Then I figured out the average, and the middle of the bell curve is 15%, which is awesome. And that's also how much Mayowa says to use in their handouts for natural dyeing. And I've said their name a number of times. They are local to me here in Vancouver, but I think that they're the greatest source for getting both the mordants and the scouring agents. That's where I got my Orvus Paste and my alum. But they also have free literature online, different PDFs that they offer, and that's a source that you can buy your natural dyes from, which is awesome. So this, it's a setup that you can do for fairly inexpensive. I got my pot from a thrift store. I got the thermometer from a free box. I think the digital kitchen scale I got from London Drugs for probably less than $20. I got the bowls from a free box. And the spoons are just leftover ones from that I've been given or handed down from different folks. So you can do this on a fairly inexpensive budget, which is awesome. But when you're doing this, I really like to just make sure that I'm scouring and mordanting properly. I know that I've said that before, but this is very important. And for projects like this, where I went through East Vancouver where I live, and either grew or wildcrafted all of these dyes from within about 3 kilometers of my house, all of these squares, they were all cut out at the same time. They were all 4 inches by 4 inches. They were all scoured at the same time, and then they were all mordanted at the same time. So what that meant is that when I wanted to do a dye bath, all that I had to do was take a couple of my squares, pre-wet them for about a half an hour, and then I'd put them into my dye pot with my dyes and then naturally dye with them. And so I didn't have to do the scouring and the mordanting, 100 times to get 100 squares. I did it just all at once. So if you prepare your fabrics and your fibers beforehand, it means that your natural dye journey will be a lot easier. And so there it is. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the notes below, but also definitely find the handout on the Mayowa website, and also check out books from other natural dyers. I do recommend The Modern Natural Dyer by Christine Vehar. That one is exceptional, and it is in most public libraries. I know that the Vancouver Public Library has a couple of copies. I would recommend Harvesting Color by Rebecca Burgess, and that kind of goes more into this idea of wildcrafting natural dyes. And then also Wild Color by Jenny Dean. But really finding any sort of natural dye sources, checking out hashtags on Instagram, just like the hashtag natural dye or hashtag natural dyer, just trying to get your info from anywhere. Do take extensive notes, because again, past you needs to tell a future you what you're doing with your life, which is great. And do keep safe. Remember, we want to have a mask anytime that you're working with powdered mordants or dye stuff. You definitely want to wear your gloves, and you want to be in a very well ventilated area. If you can get like a portable stovetop like this, you can do it outside. If you can, find somewhere, you could do it with a camp stove outside. Any way that you can do this where you can be safe and have fun. So good luck in your natural dye journey.